the Mosaic tutorial. If you're a med student and you want to make it really easy for yourself to learn medicine, head to mosaic.org. Today we're going to be talking about the posterior triangle of the neck, and I'm going to give you a really easy way of remembering the posterior triangle. I'm going to draw it out and talk about the structures that go through it. So the posterior triangle of the neck has its base at the medial 1/3 of the clavicle, and it then kind of looks a bit like a sail formed by the anterior border of trapezius and sternocleidomastoid, the posterior border of sternocleidomastoid. So there are 5 muscles that are actually inside the triangle, and the way that you draw those out is if you start with the midpoint of sternocleidomastoid and then you start with the midpoint of the clavicle. If you draw a line down there, and then at that same point on the trapezius, you draw a parallel line upwards, and then in between those 2 points, just here, you draw another parallel line downwards. And when you do that, that gives you the 4 muscles of the floor of the triangle. So this here is scalenus anterior. This is the middle scalene. This here is levator scapulae, and this is splenius. And I did say that there were 5 muscles, and that's because at about the halfway mark on the border of sternocleidomastoid, another muscle named omohyoid crosses the triangle. Now, omohyoid actually starts, has its attachment at the hyoid, and then it, through a little tendon of fascia, changes its course and heads towards the shoulder. And omo actually means shoulder, I think, in Greek, in ancient Greek. So you can remember that omohyoid is crossing the triangle, heading towards the shoulder. And they're the 5 muscles. So omohyoid, anterior scalene, middle scalene, levator scapula, and splenius, they make up the 5 muscles of the posterior triangle. So then what you have to do is remember that there's a major nerve, a major artery, and a major vein. And it's not so much a major nerve as a major group of nerves, in that it's the brachial plexus. So the brachial plexus actually arises from behind scalenus anterior. It comes out between scalenus anterior and the middle scalene, like this. I'm not going to draw all of the roots or the trunks in. I'm just going to symbolize them with a single drawing like this. So they actually arise from, they just come out from underneath the anterior scalene is the brachial plexus. And specifically, that's the trunks of the brachial plexus. Now, the trunks of the brachial plexus are sitting very close to the artery, which also arises just comes out from the anterior scalene muscle, so the rest of it is going behind the scalene muscle like this. And that is the 3rd part of the subclavian. Now, the vein is a little bit different. The subclavian vein is actually in front of the anterior scalene. So it's going like this. So just to recap, there's then the nerve, major artery, major vein. The nerve and artery, the nerve is the brachial plexus, a group of nerves. They come off behind the anterior scalene, and the artery comes off behind the anterior, or comes out behind the anterior scalene, and the vein comes out in front. So then, if you want to get a little bit more intricate, there's a few branches that come off, the supraclavicular branches that come off the brachial plexus. So there's one that comes off the roots, and that's the dorsal scapula, and that's the nerve for the rhomboids. And then there's 2 that come off the trunks, and they continue. The first one is the suprascapular nerve, and that nerve is heading to innervate supraspinatus and infraspinatus, and that basically runs in the same direction as the dorsal scapula, and then almost running 90 degrees down like this, just down like that, is this little guy. Might have to draw him in down here, and he is the nerve for Subclavius, which is just a little muscle that basically sits directly underneath and basically runs the same course as the clavicle. And I guess the only important clinical thing about this little nerve is that often it gives off an accessory phrenic branch. So it's the most common nerve to supply the accessory phrenic nerve, which then goes down and joins the proper phrenic nerve. So, okay, so now we've talked about the major nerve, artery, and vein, and we've talked about the supraclavicular branches that come off the brachial plexus, and there's two arteries which are crossing the posterior triangle, and both of them are coming off the thyrocervical trunk, which is outside. It's just medial to the triangle. But the first one crosses the omohyoid, and that is the transverse cervical. The second one basically runs parallel with it, and that is the transverse scapula, which is also known as the suprascapular. Hence you can see that it's very closely approximated with the suprascapular nerve. Now, there's two arteries running across, so you can remember arteries are going across and the vein is going vertical, and that vein